Among old versions of macOS, there's many that are discussed, such as Mavericks, featuring its relatively iconic wallpaper and similarities to both old and new macOS, or macOS Snow Leopard, the first version to support only Intel processors. Perhaps one version of macOS that flies under many people's radars is macOS Mountain Lion, an arguably equal version of macOS, featuring all the skeuomorphism you could ever ask for, a really beautiful UI that Microsoft could only aspire to achieve, and many features that basically make it a alternative to macOS Mavericks. But you don't see many folks really talk about much anymore. So today I want to look at this version of macOS, see if it lives up to my childhood expectations, and see what it's actually like. So I suppose let's get started. Now, for some background, we need to look at macOS 10.7. Released in 2011 and given the name Lion, it introduced many new features, as opposed to macOS 10.6, but it ended up with quite mixed reviews. As a result, Apple would focus for the next version of macOS on refining a lot of what was in macOS 10.7. This wasn't the first time Apple did this. After macOS 10.5 was released in quite a buggy state, although that was fixed relatively quickly, Apple would spend macOS 10.6's development period not really introducing new features. To quote their June 9th, 2008 press release announcing macOS Snow Leopard, Apple's senior vice president of software engineering, Bertrand Serlet, said that in our continued effort to deliver the best user experience, we hit the pause button on new features to focus on perfecting the world's most advanced operating system. And macOS 10.6 was released in 2009 and was received quite positively. As such, Mountain Lion was basically in a similar state to Snow Leopard, although Snow Leopard didn't have any new features. And to put it simply, macOS 10.8 was received quite positively. After its July 2012 release, it became the best-selling version of macOS up to that point in the span of the next year. However, reviewers were concerned that Windows 8 would out-innovate macOS 10.8. However, for them, Microsoft goofed up quite a bit, and Windows 8 was not received very positively upon its release not long after. Support was dropped for macOS 10.8 in November of 2015, and it was the last version of macOS to be a paid upgrade. However, Apple would later make it a free download in 2021. But anyway, I think we should actually look at it now. Well, I do need to provide some brief disclaimers first. First of all, if you've been on this channel lately, you've probably seen a bunch of videos about using different versions of Windows in 2026. This video is not like that. I'm not going to be looking at how usable macOS 10.8 is in 2026. I just thought it'd be fun to explore this version of macOS, and there will be a finale for the Windows in 2026 series next week. That brings me to the fact that despite making myself sound biased towards Apple, I am actually not very familiar with macOS and its UI and whatnot. Okay, well, I've used its UI, but to put it simply, I grew up in a sans Apple household to the point where we never even used iPods. And so I think we should just get this powered on. Now, if you look at this thing's lock screen, you'll notice that it has a lot more of a skeuomorphic look. It's not easy to get on camera here, but there's a sort of pattern that we will come across later. And you can see in the UI that there is quite a bit of eye candy. There's aspects such as the notification center and these various menus. However, when you look more at the programs, you can tell that this is not Fruiter Arrow. It's skeuomorphism. Finder has views that are quite interesting, such as this one, which allows you to preview things like, for instance, pictures or documents or program icons and stuff. And while it does have these live previews and other aspects of the OS and not just in these giant things, it really looks a lot nicer and more advanced compared to Windows. Remember, I don't use an Apple ecosystem. You can also, with the hit of a spacebar, get some brief context behind a selected item, which is quite convenient. You can also start to see more modern aspects of macOS take place. For example, how many apps go full screen. Likewise, it's not very easy to show here when my website doesn't work on this old version of Safari, but it is there. Looking at other programs, it very much exceeds my childhood expectations for this OS. For instance, looking at calendar here, it has the appearance of a calendar. Granted, it's not, say, a wall calendar like this, but it does have texture. And I actually kind of was surprised to see that in calendar. Reminders looks like a note list, and it can be used to set reminders, obviously. It's got paper and leather textures, and it integrates nicely with the system's window management controls. Notes is something I already expected to be as such, but it takes the appearance of a physical notepad with a special font. A lot of these are similar to how they were in iOS 6, which was released the same year. A new aspect in the OS is Messages, an instant messaging client that replaces iChat, which was in previous versions of macOS. Can't really use it here because 1, I do not have an Apple ID, and 2, I'm not hooked up to the internet, but it is here. Game Center provides some more skeuomorphic UI, but likewise, again, due to me not having an Apple ID and not being hooked up to the internet, I can't use it, like as if it would even still work. And as an additional note, this was something that critics criticized in the OS because there weren't many games available for the Game Center back in the day, but it basically functioned in the same way as how Microsoft intended to have games working in Windows Vista and Longhorn. You won't believe it, there's even more skeuomorphism in the OS. The Contacts book is another one that surprised me, featuring a design that is similar to a address book. To be honest, it's kind of like as if you open the book in the icon. It was also renamed Contacts in here, as opposed to it previously being called Address Book, but it's your fairly typical contact information manager, so. Now it should be said that that's the main bit of skeuomorphism in the OS. And you still have other aspects in here too, like for instance a text editor, iTunes, and preview for viewing stuff like photos and documents. While introduced in macOS 10.7, Apple was starting to experiment with a new feature, natural scrolling. Presumably this is to make things look more accurate to how you're scrolling on the scroll wheel, but to me, I at first found it quite obtrusive, and I can't really tell much of a difference. While I don't really have much to show here, there's additionally a new anti-malware feature called Gatekeeper, which protects the user based on a system of digital signatures and using apps from the Mac App Store. And there's all sorts of other minute details and whatnot, like for instance mission control, and little sound effects in areas, but I don't have all day. Performance-wise, it's not too bad, at least with looking at the OS and its visuals, as while it does take a brief amount of time to render stuff like high quality previews on images and program icons and whatnot, that is just kind of to be expected on older stuff. I'm running this on a period correct Mac Mini from late 2012, however this OS can run on older Macs, and arguably it runs well on what it's intended to run on. But anyway, I think that's going to be it for the main OS. To conclude, macOS 10.8 is arguably not that bad, and it probably exceeds my childhood expectations. I know a lot of folks are probably going to be like, but what about macOS Mavericks? That looks quite similar. With Mavericks, however, it started to get rid of a lot of that skeuomorphism, such as the legal pad design in Notes, the book texture in Contacts, and quite a bit more. And by macOS Yosemite, it was completely gone. When I was younger, I had a lot more enthusiasm for these older things which had these more eye-candy designs, especially macOS in particular. And so to finally be able to use it feels amazing. I may primarily focus a lot on Wintel stuff and Linux and all that stuff, but I of course always feel the need to look at Apple stuff every now and then. When compared to even its predecessor, it isn't very widely looked at. I looked on Google Trends, and while obviously there's no sorts of competition compared to new Mac versions, compared to period correct stuff like Windows 7, Windows 8, heck, even the Amiga, it just isn't widely searched. Anyway, did you use this OS back in the day? Did you ever try to Hackintosh it onto a PC? If so, what's your thoughts on either of those things? Do you think I should look at more Apple stuff? I tried to look at it, but I often don't really have the resources to. How do you think this compares to iOS 6? Did you enjoy this video, or is there something I forgot to address or something I could do to improve my content? Do bear in mind that looking at OSs in extensive detail is not very viable, but if you have anything to say, feel free to let me know down below in the comments, through my email, or in my Discord server, and feel free to give this video a like. But that's going to do it for this video, so thanks for watching, and have a nice day.